Finally, there was, I can't remember.
It was the woman over there was saying, you know, more or less, do you have a breaking point when the cuts really hit hard?
Well,
and will you be standing shoulder to shoulder with people who are really suffering?
Well, if we got into coalition with Labour, or if we'd been running the country ourselves, things would be different. But the only options that were available were either a coalition government with the Conservatives or a minority Conservative administration. And frankly, Labour have got what they've got, and people have got to accept that Labour decided that they weren't interested in a coalition, and therefore the Conservatives have ended up in government. And there are going to be some cuts. Unfortunately, they are going to hit some people very hard. But we've got to make sure that as Liberal Democrats that we soften those cuts to make them as fair as possible, so that the least well off are impacted by those cuts.
Thank you very much. Sunder?
I'm very brief. I don't see the Liberal Democrats using the influence they have to soften the cuts at the moment, and we would love to hear that, because it's important. I mean, even if you lose the argument with the Conservatives, it might be important to have the argument, because I think the legitimacy the Liberal Democrats have given to the argument there is no alternative, we're all going down the toilet, didn't you see what was happening in Greece, to say double the cuts and do it quickly and do it in one term. I do think this is now a contested public argument. I know Liberal Democrats on both sides of it, and I know, you know, Evan has been publicly critical of the government's position, and that's a good thing, because I think if we're being accused of being deficit deniers for having a policy that's actually really tough, and that Vince Cable argued for all the way up to election day, we're actually shaping the narrative of British politics possibly for 10 or 15 years. So I'd love to hear the Liberal Democrats actually being spiky in the way, John, that you've just said that you will be.
Couldn't Christian, Nick Clegg and Vince Cable, without breaking the coalition, just express their own unease, if indeed they feel any unease, which maybe privately they do, about how deep and how fast the cuts are going to be? Is that not... Why do they have to be so utterly, totally loyal?
You and I, we've had our discussion at the Lib Dem conference about the cuts, and I think that's the wrong topic, actually. There is a problem, okay, that we face as a party. If, as I want to see, and I hope I will have some influence through because the Democratic Party, and so the MPs don't necessarily get all the leadership, get to say what the policies are for the next election, or even what's acceptable within this Parliament. But there's a problem. Let's say that the party agrees, as I think it would, that it wants to go to the next election without any, and we can rule it out now, a pact, a seat pact with the Conservatives or any other party. And I actually think we will end up going into the election, if we can, saying that there is no preference for the Conservatives, despite knowing them and having worked with them, which is difficult, because there's a natural thing there, and making sure that we have a platform that is as distinctive as possible from the Conservatives platform, and indeed, in some cases, from the Conservative stroke shared record, which will be an interesting thing to see. The difficulty with, and therefore there may well be a policy overlap, and then hopefully the numbers, if there is a hung parliament, that will enable us to have our more natural alliance, as I would see it, for the members and the MPs and the activists, with a Labour Party, particularly a Labour Party that is not, hasn't got some of the policies that it imposed on during the last 13 years, the privatisation of the NHS, the expansion of academies and so forth, as well as the civil liberties and international war agenda. Now, but the problem with that is that it's extremely difficult to do that when you've got 4 years or 5 years of Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives jointly attacking Labour. Okay? So I recognise that problem. I don't want to see the Hugh and Varsi, or I don't want to see Varsi at all, but I want to see the Hugh Varsi show happen again, because it looked as if it was party political, and we are not in it as two parties to do the party politics. It should be just as legitimate on some issues, for a senior Liberal Democrat and a senior Labour person to attack Conservative policy. Now, with the cuts, there's inevitably going to be some of that because it's important for the coalition to demonstrate that they're not doing this because they've got the choice. The deficit has to be dealt with. But I don't know the answer yet to how that's solved. On the deficit, I think this has to be said. It isn't doubled. Because the timescale has been brought from 8 years, i.e. 2 parliaments, to 5 years, then there's going to be more cuts in this parliament than were planned for even under the Alistair Darling plan. That's a political decision, not an ideological one. There's no way the Liberal Democrats are going to go into the next election after 5 years of cuts to say, oh, and there's another 3 to come, while the Labour Party says that's it. And it's just, that's not a politically viable position for either the Liberal Democrats or the Conservatives to have. So it's a political decision to contract these cuts into a 5-year period so that there can be the great sunny uplands afterwards. But Nick Clegg in his speech at conference said that he wasn't, and this is a departure for him, he's not doing the cuts for the sake of a smaller state. Not even merely, he didn't even say merely. And 2 years ago he had said he was attracted to a smaller state. That gives the Liberal Democrats the opportunity to propose in our manifesto reinvestment as economic growth allows. There's just 2 things I want to deal with quickly beyond that. I don't understand what David's contribution was just now, because he rightly said that it was impossible for there to be a Labour-Liberal Democrat deal. And I slightly disagree with John, although I think it was right that it was explored. And I wanted it, and I was on the TV saying, yes, great, we can now have this Rainbow Alliance. In retrospect, I see it as impossible and illegitimate. Therefore, I don't understand how David can say, therefore, the Labour whip, or the Labour coalition whip, would have been okay compared to what we have to put up with under a Liberal Democrat Conservative coalition whip, because there was only one option on the table. My final point is dealing with this issue of the issue of long-term realignment and the mood music, and Nick Clegg. Okay, Nick Clegg, at least in the first instance, has to make this coalition work. Okay, the party requires him to make this coalition work. That means that he can't go around saying this is a stinking Tory policy that's been imposed upon us. No coalition worked like that. It didn't work like that in Scotland, and it doesn't work like that with centre-left coalitions in other parts of Europe. But I think it's absolutely legitimate, and this is what I'm campaigning for within our party, for our ministers, certainly the party and Simon Hughes and our president and Liberal Democrat MPs like John, to be given free rein to attack those parts of the coalition programme that are conservative, as well as to point out the things that we have done. And it's wrong to say that there hasn't been amelioration already of a budget that could have been far worse. We're never going to have cuts that are progressive, but they can be made more progressive. And that's my criticism of Nick Clegg, to talk about fair cuts. It's fairer cuts. They're never going to be fair if people who rely on public services are not those with the broadest shoulders, full stop. Anyway, but the point is that we should see our ministers being able to say by inference, if not directly, that this is a Liberal Democrat-inspired coalition policy, and some of these others are the ones that we've had to accept from the Conservatives, but they're not our preference. And I think that will emerge towards the next election.